It's good to be back here and help us all wind out the day. And I have the happy duty always of being the last thing standing between us and cocktail hour, so it forces me to be brief. I was up here 2 years ago, I think, and I shared some initial data about what technology was doing to the environment and resource consumption. And I kind of thought I was done with that topic, but it turns out it's one of those ideas that just won't let you go. So over the past couple of years, I've been diving into it more deeply, and I continue to be really amazed at what I've found because it's so surprising to me. And I want to dive back in and tell you about the latest research. I'm in the middle of writing a book about this phenomenon. I gave a TEDx Cambridge talk about it a couple weeks ago, so I'm going to shamelessly reuse my TEDx Cambridge slides and try to walk through what I'm learning about what's going on and why I find it so fantastic. To do that, I want to go back to 1970. Some of us in the room were mid-career professionals in 1970, so we remember that time pretty closely. It was also the time of the first Earth Day, and it was really when the environmental movement in the United States really took off and started to gain a huge amount of traction. In part, oops, I'm sorry, can we go back one slide? Let me do this. Whoops. Okay, yeah. In part because of this image. How many of us have seen this before? This is one of the most famous images ever taken. It's called Earthrise. It was taken by the Apollo 8 mission in 1968. And it was just this amazing reminder that we live on this fantastic place that's really delicate out there in the middle of nowhere. And it's been called the picture that inspired the environmental movement in the United States. The very next year, in 1969, we got a vivid reminder of a pretty different kind when in downtown Cleveland, the river caught on fire. In fact, the Clevelanders were so used to their river catching on fire that evidently no pictures of it survived from the 1969 fire. This was one that happened in the 50s sometime. It went to a file photo of their river catching on fire just to tell the story. And Earth Day was really a combination of these two ideas. That we live on this amazing, beautiful, delicate planet, and we were in the middle of screwing it up in some pretty important ways. And if you go back and look at the conversation, it was kind of alarmist. I get the feeling when I go back and read the books around that time that we're really seeing dispatches from a country that was in the middle of a panic attack for environmental reasons. And a few ideas that kept cropping up were that, first of all, there were way too many of us, that we were consuming too many resources too quickly, we were polluting the heck out of things, we were not going to be able to keep it up. At some point, we're going to slam into some kind of wall of scarcity, and some pretty serious things were going to happen as a result. This last book is my favorite. I am not sure that this title needs an exclamation point. Right, that feels like a tiny bit of overkill to me. But when you go back and you look at the data, you find some real support for these alarmist views. We can go back and look at some of the important trends in America in the decades leading up to 1970, and what you see over and over again is just more and more, is just growth. Our population was on this stately upward trend. Our economy was growing much more quickly. Our GDP was growing 3 or 4 times as fast as our population was. And we were in the middle of this great run. We were becoming a much, much more prosperous, wealthy society. We liked it. We liked the comforts. You can go back. We liked our stuff. There are all these great images about awesome consumerist America in the 60s and 70s. And obviously, to generate all that stuff, we used more and more resources from our Earth every year. If you look at what happened to metals use, you just see it skyrocketing. You see it really accelerating into Earth Day in 1970. The same thing is true of fertilizers and minerals that we use. The same thing is true of the amount of water that our economy consumes. Pretty obviously, the amount of energy you need for a growing economy is going to continue to go up. So you look at all this and you start to understand the panic attack around Earth Day and some of this alarmist stuff that we were reading, because we built an economy to do one thing, grow, and it did it really, really well. And it seemed just kind of endless and voracious and relentless. And in the pursuit of that growth, you didn't have to look too hard to find out that we were making some pretty serious mistakes. This pursuit of growth just appeared to be overwhelming, and we did some dumb things. In addition to letting the rivers in our major cities catch on fire, the smog problems in big cities in America were dire in the decades leading up to Earth Day. There was at least one mass extinction of a species that we thought would never happen. We killed all the passenger pigeons in America. That species is extinct because of our activities. We did a really serious job of trying to kill all the buffalo in America. We came damn close to it. The wolves were in danger, the bear were in danger, the deer were in danger. We came very close to killing one of the most majestic species on the face of the planet. We just kept on, feeding this endless desire for consumption by taking more and more from the earth. It felt like we were taking more and more at an accelerating rate, and a lot of people saying, this is not going to work. We actually have to stop this. This is planetary death by 1,000 cuts. So when you go back and look at some of the headlines and some of the quotes that people were putting up around Earth Day, you get this very strong sense, very widely shared belief that, man, we had to reverse course. We had to stop what we were doing. This relentless growth is a bad idea. We have to embrace the philosophy of degrowth, was the movement that you heard. We had to turn our back consciously on consumption and growth and resource use and embrace smaller is better, back to the land kind of degrowth. Question for the room, did we? Yeah, the chuckles are well placed. Let's keep looking at the evidence and the trends and see how much degrowth actually happened. So let's keep 1935 to 1970 up there, but then take it 35 years forward as well and look at what happened up to 2015. Our population continued to grow. Our economy continued to grow much more quickly than population, with the important divot of the Great Recession there. And if you look at most indicators of what our consumption was like and what our appetites were, you really didn't see them slow down. We kept on making things and buying things and driving vehicles more and more miles every year and eating more calories every year and just, we continued to consume. We continued to enjoy our consumption and grow our economy. I can't look at these lines and tell any story about us embracing a philosophy of degrowth. We really seemed to enjoy growth, and that didn't change. But something pretty fundamental did change, and I've gone back and looked. I can't find anybody who was anticipating this as much as it actually happened. And even today, a lot of people that I talk to aren't aware of the following, which is that even as we continue to grow in all of these ways, we actually turned a corner on taking resources from the planet. So here's what happened to our use of metals over time. And all these lines I'm going to draw about resource use are not per capita. This is total American tonnage consumption year by year of things like iron and steel. Our fertilizer use peaked. We're clearly past post-peak in fertilizer, even though we're still an agricultural powerhouse and we grow more and more crops every year. Same thing is true, our water draws, total American water draws are actually decreasing. We're chopping down fewer trees, and I think the best news that I have to share with everybody today in America, we are finally past peak paperwork, right? Go home happy. We are finally past peak paperwork. It's amazing to me, I think we might actually be past peak energy in America. Our total consumption of BTUs or joules has plateaued, seems to be going down a little bit. And while all this has been happening, the air and the water and the land in this country have been getting remarkably cleaner. If you look at the main pollutants, they are about as low as they've been in a century. So something really fundamental happened. We turned the corner on eating up our planet, on using more and more resources every year. We're now using less and less of just about every resource. The one big exception that I found so far, our total consumption of gemstones is still going up. We are not past peak bling in America. Most other things, they start to go down. So something pretty wild has happened. Even while we continue to grow and our measures of overall consumption increase, our measures of overall resource use and resource exploitation have this nice hump shape. This shape makes us very happy because we start to see things go down now in almost every resource that I can think about or that I would care about. It brings up a question pretty quickly. How did we pull this off? This is a fairly big deal. I find it incredibly good news for the planet. And it's not immediately clear what happened. To get clarity, we need to go to the obvious source, which is a Radio Shack ad from 1991. Because where else would you look for it? This is pretty wild. The guy found this literally in a pile of physical newspapers from Buffalo in 1991. And he made an interesting observation. He said, 13 out of the 15 devices in this ad have kind of vanished into the smartphone. Right? I love this. This is a wonderful example of a phenomenon that a group of researchers are calling dematerialization, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the ability to consume the things that we want: music, media, computing, voice recording, all these things, while using fewer resources, fewer materials from the planet, or in some cases, none at all. You just get this wonderful material-free consumption. And it's important to point out, I think, that this kind of dematerialization doesn't happen because we selflessly decide to turn our backs on consumption and engage in degrowth. Like, that's not what we're doing. This doesn't happen because we're noble. It happens because we're cheap. It's super straightforward. All of these things cost money that we would rather not spend. Most molecules in the world cost money, and technological progress offers us an alternative to that spending. And most of us say, you know what, I'll take that deal. And instead of buying a computer and a hard drive and a camcorder and a camera and a tape recorder and an answering machine and I'll just buy a phone. And once you're aware of this phenomenon, you start to see dematerialization all over the place. Quick show of hands, how many of us still have extensive VHS tape libraries? How many of us are still staring into a big old bulky CRT monitor? Remember how heavy those things were? I actually don't think there's a factory in the world anymore that even makes them. And it's not just media and high-tech gear. Cars today use less gasoline and less metal. Telecommunications networks use a lot less copper than they did in the past. And this old-fashioned idea of farming, where you just kind of blanket the field with water once in a while and throw fertilizer on everything, it's pretty quickly giving way to a concept of precision agriculture, where we see harvests go up while crop acreage, water and fertilizer and pesticide all go down. I find this incredibly happy news. It's happening all over the place. You can find examples of dematerialization that are big and small, obvious and subtle, facing the consumer, not facing the consumer in the economy. I think it's the best environmental news in the world. And I think what we're doing now, because of dematerialization, is actually life by 1,000 cuts. And I find that a really beautiful reversal from what we were doing before. The next question that this brings up for me is, if this is so fantastic, how do we keep this going? How do we maintain, how do we accelerate dematerialization? What are the smart things for us to be doing? And I can think of 3 things off the top of my head. The first one is we have to keep being vigilant about pollution. Pollution is what you learn in your Econ 101 class, is a negative externality, which means that businesses by themselves have no incentive to reduce it because they don't bear the cost of it unless we make them. So great, let's make them. We're learning exactly just how bad pollution is. We've known it for a while, but I just came across a study yesterday that looked at what happened to premature birth rates in a bunch of towns in California where their fossil-fueled electrical generation plant had shut down. And even though, like I said, the air is cleaner in America than it's been for a century, it still turns out when you shut down a fossil-fueled electrical plant, premature births in nearby areas go down significantly. So fighting pollution is still this urgent task. We have to keep being vigilant about it. The second thing we have to do follows pretty logically. I find it important that we stop cooking the planet. And greenhouse gases are an especially pernicious kind of pollution because they come from lots of different sources. Many of our economic activities generate greenhouse gases. Raising animals, generating electricity, driving internal combustion cars, all these things just generate greenhouse gases. So we need this portfolio of solutions to attack it. Luckily, I think we have a pretty good portfolio of solutions. We've got really good research on everything from geoengineering to batteries to lab-grown meat. The progress with renewables is pretty amazing. We have the nuclear option. I believe we should be using the nuclear option a lot more than we are right now. And I love the way Bill Gates phrases the issue. He says, look, we desperately need an energy miracle in the 21st century. And he says, we might just get one. So we need to be vigilant about this, but I find a lot of hope here the more I look into it. And then finally, the third thing that we need to do is probably the most controversial, the most counterintuitive, and it's that we have to help the rest of the world get rich. This is exactly the opposite of the Earth Day degrowth advice. Back then, the dominant thinking was that the only way we were going to save the planet is by reversing the trend of growth and turning away from consumption. That advice is really well-meaning. We now know that it's wrong. Americans have not turned their backs on consumption, and we are now engaging in treading more lightly on the planet in all the ways that matter. So as the rest of the world gets richer, they're going to do that as well. In fact, I think they're going to dematerialize a lot more quickly than we did because they have much better technologies at their disposal. Developing countries are not going to build the same endless series of coal plants that we did. They're not going to buy the same fleets of passenger vehicles that sit idle 96% of the time the way that we did. They're going to make choices that are economically smarter for themselves and luckily better for the planet as well. What we're learning, and I still find this crazy, but I think it's accurate, it's actually not prosperity that's the enemy of the environment, it's poverty. And it's not degrowth that's going to save us, it's dematerialization. I want to wind up. I showed a bunch of images about animals earlier. There's amazing good news. We hear about species extinction, and it is a problem, but a lot of our most iconic species are back from the brink. The buffalo, in fact, are back very healthy in America. After being down as low as about 500 animals at the turn of the 20th century, there are about 500,000 of them in the country now. So we're making progress on some really tough problems. The last image that I want to show you is actually the second last image I want to show you is a repeat. Remember Earthrise? Earthrise is now my second favorite environmental image of all time. I want to wind up by showing you my all-time favorite one, and it's become my favorite because it's actually not photoshopped, and it tells me what we have already been able to accomplish and what we're going to see more and more of in the future. This is a picture. I showed it a couple of years ago, so forgive me, I can't get it out of my head. This is a humpback whale off the coast of New York City. How's that for a good note to end on? I think it's cocktail hour. Thank you very much.